President Trump signaled caution toward Israel's recent strike in Doha, calling Qatar a great ally, and warning that Israel must be very, very careful. Even as Arab and Muslim leaders convened an emergency summit in Qatar, determined to coordinate a response and salvage fragile ceasefire efforts. On the ground in Gaza City, strikes intensified through Monday into the night, with residents reporting bombardments across multiple neighborhoods and hospitals receiving casualties after a heavy wave of air attacks. Israel's defense minister underscored the shift in tone with a blunt phrase, "Gaza is burning," foreshadowing an expanded operation that Israeli officials had been signaling for days. Those words weren't rhetorical flourish, they mirrored a tactical pattern we've seen repeatedly in this war. Aerial saturation, followed by rapid armored thrusts and infantry probes to test urban resistance lines. By late Monday and into early Tuesday, Israel's military announced its expanded operation in Gaza City had begun, warning civilians to move south as armor closed in on sectors long pounded by air power. Medical officials reported dozens of dead and wounded funneling into already strained facilities, while rescue crews worked through rubble under flare-lit skies. Diplomatically, the optics were jarring. Arab and Muslim leaders in Doha warned that the Qatar strike jeopardized mediation, while in Jerusalem the US posture balanced unease over regional spillover with stated unwavering support for Israel's core war aims. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's shuttle underscored Washington's calculus, strong backing for Israel's objective to neutralize Hamas, alongside pressure to compress timelines to salvage a narrow window for a hostage and ceasefire framework. That window, by US reckoning, is measured in days and weeks, not months. Strategically, the Gaza City focus is about symbolism and systems, Hamas's command and control, its remaining tunnel access points, and its ability to stage above-ground resistance in dense, compartmented districts. Israeli officials argue that seizing the urban core would break Hamas's governing symbol, creating leverage for hostage deals and degrading the group's operational coherence. But Israel's own security chiefs have flagged the risks, potential heavy IDF casualties, hostage endangerment, and the burden of protracted urban control over millions of civilians if military governance expands by default. For civilians, Monday's escalation compounded displacement, with hundreds of thousands already fleeing Gaza City after evacuation calls, and more families moving under bombardment toward areas that still lack food, water, and reliable medical care. UNRWA reported repeated strikes on agency facilities across recent days, underscoring the erosion of humanitarian space, while hospitals described non-stop intake from multi-house strikes in western and southwestern districts. In practical terms, every kilometer Israeli armor advances increases the density and complexity of the civilian-military overlap, the very environment where collateral risk surges. Regionally, Monday's Doha summit mattered for two reasons. First, it sought to restore a pathway for mediation after the shock of a strike inside Qatar, host to US forces and central to talks. Second, it tested whether a unified Arab position could translate into concrete diplomatic or economic pressure on Israel. Early signals suggested rhetorical cohesion, but limited immediate punitive steps, revealing the gap between public condemnation and actionable leverage when regional economies and security ties are intertwined with Western partners. From Washington's vantage point, the through line on Monday was speed, press Israel to compress operations, avoid a grinding occupation dynamic, and reopen a credible channel for a limited deal while hostages remain a core variable. Trump's public messaging, praising Qatar as an ally and counseling care, was calibrated to contain escalation fallout without breaking with Israel's objectives, an attempt to keep Doha's mediation lane open after a direct shock to its sovereignty. That balance is precarious, because every strike that lands in or near diplomatic lanes risks hardening positions across the region. Bottom line for Monday, aerial intensity set battlefield conditions, ground elements edged into Gaza City's periphery and beyond, and diplomacy scrambled to keep a narrow negotiation window from collapsing. The military logic points toward quick, high-intensity urban operations aimed at shattering remaining Hamas nodes, but the political and humanitarian costs mount with each block taken, especially if hostages are used as shields, or if urban governance vacuums widen. Whether this approach produces leverage, or locks all sides into a deeper morass, will hinge on what follows the current push, and how fast diplomacy can turn battlefield shock into a bargaining moment. President Donald Trump has issued a direct ultimatum to NATO allies. He says the United States will only impose what he calls major new sanctions on Russia if all NATO nations agree to do the same and stop buying oil from Moscow. In a letter he posted to his social media platform, Trump told NATO leaders that continued purchases of Russian oil by some members are shocking, and that these transactions weaken the alliance's negotiating position against the Kremlin. He added that NATO's commitment to winning the war in Ukraine has been far less than 100%, and that collective action is the only way to force Russia to the negotiating table. Trump's demands go beyond sanctions. He is also calling for NATO countries to impose tariffs of between 50% and 100% on Chinese goods, with the promise that these tariffs would be fully withdrawn once the war in Ukraine ends. According to Trump, China has a strong control over Russia, and such tariffs would break that grip, accelerating an end to what he calls a deadly but ridiculous war. This approach marks a significant escalation in linking trade policy with wartime strategy, and it raises questions about whether NATO members, many of whom have deep economic ties to China, would be willing to take such steps. European Union members have already banned most maritime imports of Russian oil and refined products, but exemptions remain for certain countries, and some NATO members outside the EU, such as Turkey, continue to buy Russian crude. Analysts note that Trump's ultimatum effectively targets these remaining buyers and seeks to close the gap in sanctions enforcement that allows Russia to keep earning energy revenue. However, critics warn that imposing sweeping tariffs on China could trigger a trade war, potentially harming NATO economies without guaranteeing a shift in Russia's position. Before we continue, what's your take on this strategy? Would a united NATO oil embargo and high tariffs on China really bring Russia to the table? Or could it backfire economically on the alliance? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. And if you value clear, fact-driven geopolitical updates without the noise, hit subscribe now. NENC Media Group, new videos every other day. Returning to the developments, Trump has already acted unilaterally in some cases, recently doubling tariffs on India to 50% over its continued purchases of Russian oil. A move he acknowledged has caused a rift with New Delhi. India has called the measure unjustified, pointing out that other nations also maintain energy trade with Moscow. European officials, meanwhile, have signaled reluctance to adopt Trump's full plan, particularly the tariff component, arguing that such measures are not their preferred tool for foreign policy pressure. The timing of Trump's ultimatum is notable. It comes after his August meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska, talks that raised hopes for a breakthrough, but ultimately produced no agreement. Since then, fighting in Ukraine has continued, with Russian forces launching new drone and missile attacks, and Ukrainian units holding defensive lines while conducting limited counterattacks. Trump's critics argue that delaying US sanctions until NATO aligns with his conditions could give Moscow more time to consolidate gains. Supporters counter that only unified action will have the necessary impact to change Russia's calculus. From a strategic perspective, the proposal ties together three pressure points: energy revenue, trade leverage over China, and alliance unity. If NATO were to fully stop buying Russian oil, it would close one of the last major revenue streams funding the war. If tariffs on China were imposed collectively, it could strain Beijing's economic relationship with Moscow, potentially reducing its willingness to provide indirect support. And if all of this were done in concert, Trump argues the war could end quickly. Though many experts caution that Moscow's decision-making is influenced by more than just economic pressure. For now, it remains unclear whether NATO will adopt any part of Trump's ultimatum, or whether the US will move ahead with its own sanctions regardless of Allied consensus. What is certain is that the proposal has injected new tension into transatlantic discussions, highlighting the ongoing debate over how best to pressure Russia while managing the economic fallout for NATO members. President Trump arrived at Windsor Castle on Wednesday, greeted by King Charles III, Queen Camilla, and the Prince and Princess of Wales, for what was described as the largest ceremonial welcome for a foreign leader in decades. The day began with a carriage procession through the Windsor estate, Trump riding alongside King Charles in the Irish state coach, while Queen Camilla and First Lady Melania Trump followed in the Scottish state coach. Behind them, William and Catherine the Prince and Princess of Wales, joined the procession, as more than 1,000 troops lined the route. A 41-gun salute thundered from the castle grounds and the Tower of London, while military bands played the national anthems of both nations. The spectacle was deliberate, a show of royal soft power designed to underscore the special relationship between Washington and London. Inside Windsor Castle, Trump inspected a guard of honor drawn from the Grenadier Guards, Coldstream Guards, and Scots Guards, before joining the royal family for a private lunch in the state dining room. Later, the Trumps were shown a special royal collection display of artifacts linked to American history, including gifts exchanged between past presidents and monarchs. In a solemn moment, Trump laid a wreath at the tomb of Queen Elizabeth II in St. George's Chapel, before touring the chapel itself, a resting place for generations of British monarchs. The day's events culminated in a glittering state banquet in St. George's Hall, where Trump delivered a speech praising the resilience of the U.S.UK alliance, while King Charles toasted the enduring friendship between the two nations. Among the guests were Prime Minister Keir Starmer, senior cabinet ministers, and prominent business leaders, including American tech executives invited to highlight the economic dimension of the visit. Symbolically, Wednesday's pageantry carried multiple layers. First, it was unprecedented. No American president has ever been granted a second state visit to Britain. Typically, second-term presidents are offered a private lunch or tea with the monarch, not a full ceremonial welcome. Extending this honor to Trump was a calculated diplomatic gesture, signaling Britain's desire to keep Washington close at a time of global turbulence. Second, the royal spectacle was aimed at Trump personally. British officials know that Trump responds to grandeur and symbolism, and the hope was that such treatment would reinforce his sense of the special relationship and encourage favorable positions in trade and security talks. Third, the timing mattered. With the war in Ukraine grinding on, and with Trump pressing NATO allies on sanctions and tariffs, Britain sought to position itself as Washington's most reliable partner. The banquet speeches emphasized unity, but the subtext was clear. London wants to remain Trump's first call in Europe. Outside the castle walls, protests gathered in London and Windsor, criticizing Trump's policies and his presence. Yet inside, the focus remained on ceremony and diplomacy. The contrast highlighted the dual nature of state visits: spectacle for the cameras and substance behind closed doors. Outside the castle walls, protests gathered in London and Windsor, criticizing Trump's policies and his presence. Yet inside, the focus remained on ceremony and diplomacy. The contrast highlighted the dual nature of state visits: spectacle for the cameras and substance behind closed doors. Analysts noted that while Wednesday was dominated by pageantry, the real negotiations would come Thursday at Chequers with Prime Minister Starmer. Still, the optics of Wednesday set the stage. By wrapping Trump in royal tradition, Britain aimed to flatter and anchor him before the harder conversations on tariffs, Ukraine, and Israel. From a geopolitical perspective, Wednesday's events were less about immediate policy and more about narrative. Britain projected itself as America's indispensable ally. Trump basked in the symbolism of royal acceptance, and both sides reinforced the idea of continuity in the special relationship. But beneath the glitter, questions lingered. Would Trump's demands on NATO sanctions fracture alliance unity? Would Britain secure relief on tariffs and new investment deals? And would the royal spectacle translate into tangible diplomatic gains? Bottom line for Wednesday: the day was about optics, history, and symbolism. Trump's second state visit broke precedent. The pageantry was unmatched, and the royal family played its role as diplomatic amplifier. For Britain, it was a chance to bind Trump closer. For Trump, it was validation on the world stage. And for observers, it was a reminder that in geopolitics, ceremony is never just ceremony, it is strategy in velvet and gold. On Thursday, President Trump left Windsor Castle's royal pageantry behind and turned to hard politics at Chequers, the official country residence of Prime Minister Keir Starmer. The two leaders met for several hours of closed-door talks, before emerging to announce what they called the Tech Prosperity Deal, a sweeping package of US investment in Britain worth more than £150 billion, or about $200 billion. The deal covers artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and nuclear energy, with US giants like Microsoft, Google, and Blackstone pledging billions. Starmer hailed it as the biggest investment package in British history, while Trump called it proof of an unbreakable bond between the two nations. But the summit was not just about economics. It was also about geopolitics. Trump used the joint press conference to vent frustration with Moscow, declaring that Russian President Vladimir Putin had let me down after months of stalled negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. This was a striking admission, because Trump has long portrayed himself as uniquely capable of striking deals with Putin. By saying publicly that Putin failed to deliver, Trump signaled both disappointment and pressure, a message aimed at Moscow as much as at NATO allies. On Ukraine, Starmer pressed Trump to commit to long-term support for Kyiv, warning that wavering signals from Washington embolden Russia. Trump's response was cautious. He repeated that he wants a deal as soon as possible, but stopped short of promising open-ended military aid. Still, the symbolism of standing beside Britain's Prime Minister and voicing disappointment in Putin suggested a harder edge than some allies expected. The two leaders also clashed politely over Gaza. Starmer confirmed that Britain intends to recognize a Palestinian state in the coming days, a move Trump openly disagreed with. "That is one of our few disagreements," Trump said, insisting that recognition would reward Hamas while hostages remain in captivity. Starmer countered that recognition is part of a broader package, aimed at securing both a safe Israel and a viable Palestine. The exchange underscored a fault line, Britain aligning with European partners on Palestinian statehood, while Washington under Trump remains firmly opposed. Trade tensions also surfaced. Britain had hoped to secure relief from US steel and aluminum tariffs, but Trump refused to lift them, warning that the UK must not become a backdoor for foreign steel into the American market. For Starmer, this was a domestic setback, but the massive tech deal softened the blow. Strategically, Thursday's summit highlighted three themes. First, economic leverage. By tying Britain into US tech and nuclear supply chains, Trump is binding London closer to Washington and positioning the alliance against China's rise in advanced industries. Second, Ukraine diplomacy. Trump's "Putin let me down" remark was more than rhetoric. It was a signal that patience is running out, and that Moscow risks losing even the limited goodwill it once had in Washington. Third, Middle East divergence. The Gaza disagreement showed that even close allies can split on recognition and timing, a reminder that the special relationship is not absolute. For Starmer, the summit was a political lifeline. Facing domestic criticism and cabinet turmoil, he needed a win. The tech prosperity deal gave him one, allowing him to present Britain as a hub for future industries, and himself as a leader who can manage Trump. For Trump, the visit reinforced his image as a global dealmaker, delivering investment, projecting strength, and keeping allies on edge. His remarks on Putin added drama, while his refusal to bend on tariffs showed toughness. Bottom line for Thursday, Chequers was about substance after spectacle. The US and UK sealed a record-breaking tech deal. Trump signaled frustration with Putin, and the two leaders exposed differences on Gaza and trade. The optics were warm, the words were sharp at times, and the outcomes were mixed. But the message was clear. The U.S.U.K. bond remains central, even as both leaders navigate diverging pressures at home and abroad. On Friday, Ukraine escalated its campaign against Russia's energy sector, launching long-range drone strikes on oil facilities deep inside Russian territory. Explosions were reported at a petrochemical complex in Bashkortostan and at a refinery in the Volgograd region, with fires breaking out and operations temporarily halted. Ukrainian security sources confirmed that the targets were chosen to disrupt Russia's oil revenues, a key funding stream for Moscow's war effort. This was not an isolated strike. Ukrainian drones also hit pumping stations along the Kuibyshev-Tikhoretsk pipeline, a major artery feeding oil exports through Novorossiysk. The attacks underscored Kyiv's strategy to take the war beyond the front lines and into the infrastructure that sustains Russia's economy. Russia responded with its own claims. The chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, declared that Russian forces were gaining ground in almost all directions, citing advances near Yampol and Pokrovsk. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky countered, insisting that Russian losses in Pokrovsk were mounting, and praising what he called Ukraine's heroic defense. The information war was as fierce as the battlefield itself. Moscow projecting momentum, Kyiv highlighting resilience. The strikes also reverberated across Europe. Latvia reported debris from a Russian drone washing up near the port city of Ventspils. A reminder that the conflict's spillover risks extend into NATO territory. In Poland, the US approved a $780 million sale of Javelin missile systems, while Ukraine agreed to train Polish soldiers in drone defense. Meanwhile, the European Commission advanced its 19th sanctions package, this time targeting Russian liquefied natural gas, a move Commission President Ursula von der Leyen framed as turning off the tap on Moscow's war economy. Against this backdrop, President Trump delivered some of his most pointed remarks yet about Vladimir Putin. In a Fox News interview, Trump said he was very disappointed in Putin, admitting that he once thought the Russia-Ukraine conflict would be the easiest to settle, because of his personal relationship with the Russian leader. The one I thought was going to be easiest was Russia-Ukraine, because of my relationship with President Putin. So I'm disappointed, Trump said. He added that Putin had really let me down, echoing comments he made earlier in the week alongside Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Trump's words carried weight. For months, he has positioned himself as the leader who could end the war quickly, leveraging personal ties and deal-making skills. By admitting disappointment, Trump signaled that Moscow had failed to deliver on private assurances, and that patience in Washington was wearing thin. At the same time, Trump revealed he had spoken with Chinese President Xi Jinping, describing the call as very productive, and saying Beijing might play a role in pushing for settlement. This was a notable shift, bringing China into the diplomatic equation more directly. Strategically, Friday highlighted three dynamics. First, Ukraine's escalation. By striking oil infrastructure hundreds of kilometers inside Russia, Kyiv is showing it can hit Moscow's economic lifelines, not just its frontline troops. Second, Russia's counter-narrative. Claims of gains in Donetsk and elsewhere are meant to offset the perception of vulnerability, but the reality is contested. Third, Trump's pivot. His disappointment in Putin and outreach to Xi suggest a recalibration. The US president is signaling that if Moscow won't deliver, Washington may look to Beijing to help broker an endgame. For Ukraine, Friday was both a tactical success and a strategic gamble. The strikes disrupted Russian oil flows, but they also risked retaliation and escalation. For Russia, the challenge was to project strength while absorbing blows to its economy. For NATO and the EU, the day underscored the urgency of shoring up defenses, from Poland's javelins to Europe's LNG sanctions. And for Trump, the message was personal and political. By saying Putin let me down, he reframed the narrative, from confident dealmaker to disappointed partner. Whether that disappointment translates into tougher US policy, or simply more pressure on allies, remains to be seen. Bottom line for Friday, Ukraine struck at Russia's oil heartland. Russia claimed battlefield gains. Europe tightened sanctions, and Trump admitted frustration with Putin. The war showed no sign of ending, but the diplomatic chessboard shifted, with Washington hinting that China may now hold a piece of the key. Saturday began with one of the largest Russian air assaults in months. A wave of more than 600 drones and missiles launched overnight across Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky reported that 3 people were killed and dozens wounded when a missile carrying cluster munitions struck an apartment block in the city of Dnipro. Rescue workers pulled survivors from rubble, while fires burned through residential towers and civilian infrastructure. Ukraine's Air Force said it intercepted the majority of incoming weapons, shooting down more than 550 drones and dozens of cruise missiles. Still, the scale of the attack was staggering, stretching air defense systems thin across 9 regions including Kyiv, Odessa, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhia. The assault came just hours after Russian jets crossed into NATO airspace. Estonia reported that 3 Russian MiG-31 fighters entered its skies over the Gulf of Finland for 12 minutes, the most serious violation in more than 20 years. NATO scrambled interceptors, while officials in Brussels condemned Moscow's reckless and dangerous behavior. Moscow denied the incursion, claiming its aircraft flew over neutral waters en route to Kaliningrad. But the incident followed earlier drone spillovers into Poland, raising fears of deliberate testing of NATO's red lines. In Washington, President Trump said he had not yet been fully briefed, but warned that, "I don't like when that happens. It could be big trouble." His words reflected the unease of an alliance already stretched by the war in Ukraine, and now facing direct airspace challenges on its own borders. European leaders echoed the alarm. France called the incursion unprecedented in 2 decades. Britain's defense secretary described it as reckless and dangerous, and NATO officials convened emergency consultations. The symbolism was clear. Moscow was willing to probe NATO's resolve, even as it escalated inside Ukraine. For Ukraine, Saturday's strikes underscored both vulnerability and resilience. The damage in Dnipro was severe, yet the interception rate showed that Western-supplied air defenses remain effective under extreme pressure. For Russia, the barrage was a demonstration of capacity, a reminder that despite sanctions and losses, it can still unleash mass firepower. Strategically, the combination of a massive assault on Ukraine and a brazen airspace violation against NATO sent a dual message. To Kyiv, Russia can still inflict pain. To the West, Moscow is prepared to test boundaries and absorb the diplomatic fallout. Bottom line for Saturday, Ukraine endured one of the heaviest bombardments of the war. NATO confronted a direct airspace breach, and Washington signaled unease at the risks of escalation. The war showed no sign of slowing, and the danger of spillover into Europe grew sharper. That wraps up this week in geopolitics, from Gaza's escalation, to Trump's ultimatums and state visit, to Ukraine's strikes and Russia's massive response. If you found this breakdown useful, hit subscribe, drop a comment with your thoughts, and join me again next Sunday for another clear, fact-driven recap of the week's biggest global stories. Thanks for watching.